Welcome, everyone, to the Real Geek podcast, where we discuss the financial state of the world by providing insight and data. I'm your host, Johnny Garcia, founder and president of the Real Geek Incorporated, which has been helping clients with all their real estate and mortgage needs since 2019. We hope our show provides a little clarity about big issues. After all, it's just math and science. Also, don't forget to subscribe and drop us a like. Now, on to the show. Welcome, everyone, to this week's episode of the Real Geek Podcast. This is your host, Johnny Garcia. And as always, I got my two co-hosts, Ron Davison and Dr. Yang Hu. And this week's topic, we decided to cover, a very minor topic called taxes. We wanted to kind of go over the different types of taxes there are, how the tax system works, what taxes are used for, and just kind of see it over time and how it has shaped and affected both the economy and just the country in general. So good morning, guys. Sorry, Yang was actually already talking about a lot of cool stuff that unfortunately I hadn't recorded. So here we are recording. Yang, you're muted, by the way, FYI. Okay, so the first thing I wanted to talk about, guys, out there is most people wanted to understand the idea of how our U.S. federal tax system works. A lot of times in my business, as far as mortgages and whatnot, people are under the impression that the more money they make, the total amount of money they make gets taxed by the tax rate that they fall into, which is not the case. In the U.S., we have what's called a progressive tax, which means everyone gets taxed the exact same amount in the different brackets of income for that particular tax rate. For example, right here you guys can see my screen, right?
Yep.
Okay. So, right, for example, here I have the IRS website that is showing the 2022 tax brackets. And basically what this is saying is anyone making less than $10,275 dollars a year, you're not even going to pay income tax. And that's for an individual. Joint, $20,550. If you were to make between $10,275 and $41,774, you get taxed 12%, $41,775 to $89,007. I'm just going down to single ones. You can see them married next to it, so on and so forth. So only the money you make within that bracket is taxed at that percent. So yes, if you and your wife make $450,000 a year, yes, you fall into the 35% tax bracket, but only $19,000 of that income is being taxed at 35%. Another thing that we're going to go ahead and talk about is the different types of taxes there are. So most people just assume, one of the things that you hear a lot on the news is like, oh, we want to tax the 1%, make them, pay their fair share. And I think one of the things that gets left out of that argument is most of the top 1%ers don't make their money through a normal waged income. They actually make it through capital gains. So capital gains is a different type of tax, which is, correct me if I'm wrong, guys, is it still at 20% or is it at 15?
I don't know what the marginal rate is now, but yeah, it's a different
rate. I think long term is 20%, I think.
Yeah, yeah. So they got different ones out there for that. So significantly less. So like most people, most millionaires and billionaires have their money in stocks or in other different types of investment vehicles that generate their wealth that way. So that is taxed. And of course, most of that is, held in, taxed or LLCs or different legal entities that allow them to write off a lot of taxes. There's tax havens. There's all types of ways to get around it. But unfortunately, that lack of revenue into the federal tax system causes some significant issues. One being, of course, the national debt, or more importantly, the federal, it's hard to budget if you don't know how much money you're getting, because, you think you're going to get this amount of money and then all of a sudden you don't. Any comments so far, guys? Am I explaining that right?
Yeah, I think one thing we can come back to is whether the debt and this sounds weird to say, whether it's actually a liability or whether it's an asset. And that goes all the way back to Alexander Hamilton and Jefferson's.
Yeah, there's actually an argument to be made, and I've reading a lot of contradictory, or I mean, on purpose, right? I kind of read on both sides, and on a government level, spending is what is what triggers the economy. Whether or not national debt is a bad thing is a kind of hard subject to talk about, right? You have very different viewpoints from different types of economists, right? You have the other ones who say it's a liability. We owe too much debt to foreign countries. They can use that against us, which is not necessarily a false statement, but also, we're so intertrenched with each other that I think hurting us through the monetary system would also impact them on the same scale. So what do you guys think? Is that a fair statement to make?
Yeah, there's so many layers to this. I will do the classic history thing, right? Because that's me. Lincoln really got the national debt. I mean, Alexander Hamilton wanted it, and it's part of the banking system and part of bringing together the debt from the American Revolutionary War. Lincoln was the guy who, along with Salmon Chase, he came up with a system where he turned Americans into bondholders, made them capitalists. And so shop girls and farmers were buying bonds in order to help finance the Civil War. And one of the fascinating things about that, it enabled him to not just build railroads and put in land colleges, land lease colleges, like all the names we know today, like University of California. And so these universities sprung up from the same kind of actions he took to create an investment environment. And so, debt, if it's used to do two things, which Lincoln did: one, invested; two, you're turning your citizens into capitalists. And remember, when the country was founded, that was not the norm. There was very, 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 very few people who had anything to do with capital, understood investment, any of that. And to popularize that was a huge and massive undertaking, which transformed the world. So anyway, debt is a way to create possibilities for your government in terms of big investments they could make, and then turn your citizens into investors in that they will then get bond interest rates on their bonds they've purchased, the debt they've taken off or loaned, I guess, really the government. So
I kind of like that, because in essence, it's like making the citizens have skin in the game. We all want to see the country succeed because its success is going to pay me my interest.
Yeah, and it's not just skin in the game. The three major inflection points where we had just phenomenal economic growth for a generation later, they involved massive amounts of debt to do a particular thing. The American Revolution left the country in incredible levels of debt. Then the Civil War, same thing. And then World War II, and coming into that out of the Great Depression. And all three of those, we were blessed with these great leaders who essentially invested this debt in, one, creating a country; two, creating capital markets and infrastructure; and three, then with FDR and the labor movement, it wasn't just capital, but it was GI Bills, putting money into student education, those kind of things. All of those things brought us up in the next level. And if you are a business, you're going to invest and you're going to get returns. And so almost more important to me than the level of debt is, what's it for? What difference will it make in the future? And I would agitate and argue. My wife, she teaches kindergarten in a school that's very poor little neighborhood. Massive amount of investments in children. There's no advantage to poverty that I can see them growing up in. And that is going to make a difference 20 years from now, right? Did the community invest in these kids to make sure that they had opportunities? You could go into debt over that, and you could arguably get returns on that would be multiples of whatever you paid. So debt, I think, almost as important as the levels of debt, which is non-trivial, we need to look at it, is what are we doing with that debt?
Speaking of what we do with that debt here, and those are actually great points, and researching this topic for this week, I was trying to figure out, when did income taxes come into the, because one of the main reasons we revolted is, not just taxes, is taxes without representation, but you can argue it was for a bunch of other reasons.
Yeah.
But most of the tax burden or the tax revenue generated in the early parts of the country were from excise tax and tariff tax, right? Which eventually would make things very, very expensive. and whatnot. It was Lincoln who finally, because of the Civil War, who implemented the first income tax to offset the, because they started to bring down tariff taxes and whatnot. But I believe it was like struck down a year later by the Supreme Court as unconstitutional because the Constitution said that it had to be proportional to population. And so they ended up making an amendment into the Constitution. I believe it's the 16th Amendment that specifically states that the U.S. government can tax income regardless of what the census and the population and all that is, so that they could start doing that. But on the heels of that, just like you said, they started seeing some of the largest growth in middle class and industry we've ever seen. I mean, the growth of the Industrial Revolution, I would argue that the Industrial Revolution, couldn't have happened without the influx of government money into a lot of these systems and loans and whatnot.
So I want to make a point about this. So a very common kind of social media meme is along the line of the government should be as responsible as individuals or corporation when it comes to debt. Now, when you think about this, you know what? You go and get a mortgage. You're getting a $500,000 mortgage. You don't make anything like that. And so you have people saying, well, oh my God, the government's having this, massive debt to income ratio. Well, if you get a mortgage, your debt to income ratio is 4-to-1. And if you think, and again, I'm not saying that that's always good. People can get over leveraged, countries can go, but just as companies have issued corporate bonds and people get mortgages, that's basically how capitalism works. You borrow money, so that you can increase your future income, whether you buy a house, as a domicile, or whether companies borrow money to increase their capital stock, whether governments borrow money to build bridges, it's all about borrowing money to increase your productivity. And again, that doesn't always happen and you can go wrong, but that's part of the process.
Well, and on top of the productivity, right? I think one of the things that I personally look at and I'm thinking about what needs to be done is like a lot of these corporations, I mean, we all use the same infrastructure. We all use the same roads, the same airlines, the same runways, the same, rivers and dams and electrical grids and all that. And all of that, yes, they're private. The services are privately, well, in most cases, privately provided, but all of that system is subsidized by the U.S. government. It's regulated by the U.S. government. It's indirectly maintained by we just passed a national infrastructure bill because literally our bridges are collapsed or, crumbling. States and cities aren't the ones responsible. They don't have the revenue to take care of things like that. But a simple bridge or rail expansion could devastate the entire supply line of an entire region, affecting the entire country. So, and all of us, we've already experienced what happens during the pandemic when the supply chain gets cut off. So it's to everyone's benefit that these things are maintained and secured. But and oddly enough, looking here at these categories, these agencies, let me go back to category instead of agency. The things I'm talking about, dams, roads, FAA, all that, NTSB, all that, it's only 2% of the budget. What's the majority? Social Security and health. And I think the comment I had made before the podcast started to you guys, I still believe it. I'm like, unless you want to start letting your relatives move in with you when they retire so that you can afford to take care of them, or you want to start letting people die who go in car accidents or have a heart attack because, you have to run their credit first to see if they can afford the surgery you're about to give them. These top two categories are a necessity. I mean, I think Yang was making a point beforehand about, the big problem in the U.S. and the low-hanging fruit. I think what it was his point was the healthcare system. Yang,
there's talk now about cutting Social Security. One of the many ways that's such a weird little game where you're trying to distract everybody. It's just stupid for 1,001 reasons, but one just simple and obvious one is every month Americans pay into Social Security. Every month different Americans collect Social Security, and if you blew up Social Security and just check it out, you wouldn't get a 19% reduction in federal spending because you'd also lose a massive amount of Social Security income coming in off of paychecks. And so on net, if you said, well, what would this do to the deficit? I don't know the details of it, but I'm pretty sure it'll be pretty close to a wash. So you're making this huge impact on people's lives, and exactly how you articulated it, Johnny. You know, think about what Social Security did for poverty among older people was phenomenal. Just lowered it so much. So suddenly you'd have chronic, poverty with just a ton of people, and the most vulnerable people. And you really wouldn't see any difference in the current deficit because you also wouldn't be getting Social Security pay. So it's just absurd. It's just a silly thing.
No, I agree. But Yang, you were making a point before the podcast about the healthcare system. You were comparing it, I believe, to one of the Nordic countries.
No, I was comparing to Singapore because I was just in Singapore.
Oh, well, there you go.
So per capita expenditure for Singapore is something like 3,000-4,000. Our total per capita expenditure is something like 12,000. This includes state, federal, and private. Just on average. So we spend 12,000. Singaporeans on average save about 3,000-4,000, and they live, I think they live 9 years longer than Americans, something of that effect, and so at this
Don't
point.
they realize how much they could save on Social Security if they shorten that? Sorry.
But
someone might hear you.
so let's suppose that if we can just hypothetically, if we can just put the 15% government expenditure, that's that's I don't know whether this budget includes transfer payments and stuff like that. If it does, it's something in the neighborhood of the government budget. The government budget is about 4.4 trillion. The total that's your tax. That's your discretionary. When you can put in transfer payments, I don't know what that's like 7, 8, 9, 10 trillion. But if you can get expenditure from 12,000 down to 4,000, that's a lot of extra money. And some of it will be you just have more real income. People are spending less out of pocket. Also, the government's paying less, and that means that they will have, they will save a lot of money on expenditure. And this is, at the end of the day, it's real income that matters.
100%. And I think the government, and most people, one of the biggest arguments I always hear about the privatization of healthcare is, without that money, they couldn't develop new drugs. But most of these drug programs are actually subsidized by the federal government. I mean,
my response to that has always been Novartis is a French conglomerate. How are they, and they're based in the EU. If they can make drugs under the European, under the EU healthcare system, you know what, Merck can do it.
100%. At the end of the day, it's I mean, I remember reading I want to say Wealth of the Nations, but I don't think it was. I might have been something that was summarizing Wealth of the Nations, but two of the most critical aspects of a functional capitalistic economy is to have a healthy and educated workforce. Okay, without those two things, your economy will suffer or not prosper. And that really, rang a bell with me. And I'm like, it's funny how I think healthcare and education are two critical components that not people just have a right to, which they absolutely do, but I think it's almost a national imperative that we make this not for, people think of it, we're just trying to, pay for other people's whatever. And I'm like, well, no, this is a way to keep the country floating and progressing and growing and getting better. There used to be a time in this country where people were shooting for and competing to go to Ivy League schools. And now you don't hear that anymore. Okay. People are just it's almost taboo to be smart these days. It's very disheartening, but
people are still definitely competing to good schools. That's definitely happening. But
at the same level, I think
there are investments the community makes, and it's young. And I think one of the challenges we have, if you go all the way back to First Nations, you would teach your child hunting, gathering. That's essential. That's so you can survive, right? And then later, as the Europeans were coming into North America, you teach your child more and more how to farm. And some of the First Nations had traditional farming stuff as well, but that was vital. That was for them to be productive. And that was an investment you made in teaching. Later, like Texas A&M, it's one of the first of these land colleges, agriculture and machinery. And you're teaching people how to work in factories, you're teaching them how to be successful on farms. This is essential if you want the future to work, right? And so one of the weird, bizarre things that we're dealing with now is, and this is going to sound like I'm spewing cliches, but it's just so true. Things are dynamic enough. The future is uncertain enough. Even what will add value and work is uncertain enough for the next generation. If you think about 16-year-olds and their peak earning years might be 56. So we're talking 40 years into the future. We're trying to make a prediction about what they need to know and be able to do to be productive. Well, that strikes me as filled with lots of caveats, right? So one of the problems, it's a beautiful thing that we have dynamic economy and change and technology, but it also makes it problematic when you talk about investment in our kids to prepare them for a future that's more uncertain, right? And I think one of the things that probably shift in a model, we didn't used to educate teenagers. Beginning of the century, 1900, it was about 10% of teenagers in school, and it was about 90% by the end. I think in a similar way, we're going to probably see a more iterative notion of education. So you get your education, you launch your career, and sometime between 30 and 45, you hit it again. And we need to invest in people again, right? So that whole notion of a community invest in individuals beyond what they can afford, right? And that's high school in a nutshell, right? What 15-year-old can come up with tuition money for high school? Community invest in their people in order to make them productive, and that benefits everyone. And so that, Jerry Brown's dad, Pat Brown, he argued that he had free university education. And he said, what happens is these people, they graduate from a UC, they're more productive later, or Cal State, or even the community college, they're more productive later, they pay more taxes, and we can afford to sustain those schools. That's really the kind of thing that I think anytime you talk about debt, anytime you talk about government spending, again, go back to what systems are we creating, what investments are we making so that the future becomes better?
So to that point, exactly. I mean, I remember just talking to my cousin who went to Cal State Fullerton, which is where I went. I went from 98 to 2002. I was paying $800 a semester. I believe he's paying something like $3,000 a semester. It's just ridiculous. I'm like, I thought this was supposed to be, subsidized by the government and this and that. I'm like, how is it that it's getting so expensive? And one of the things that I was researching, and this is one of the things that really jumped out at me. The largest, and I'm not saying, unfortunately, correlation doesn't always mean causation, but I think there's something to this one. When the highest tax brackets were in the, extraordinarily high 80s and 90s, that's where we saw the largest expansion of the middle class in history. It basically said, hey, as soon as you're doing well, anything you do more than that, put it back into the system to help someone else get to your level, was a benefit and a boon for everyone. And I think one of the big things in that, in that area was education. Not only that, you also had to, this is after World War II, for example, the GI Bill and a bunch of other different things. If we're willing to give it to our soldiers, we should be willing to give it to everyone, is what I think. There's a net benefit to providing quality education to everyone. But unfortunately, the way the system works right now, and it goes into the next section of the different types of taxes there are, most school systems, at least in California, I don't know about the rest of the country, are funded by property taxes, which I think is kind of backwards, because that legitimately, maybe indirectly, makes poor neighborhoods have poor schools, which leads to poor education, which leads to poor jobs, which continues this vicious cycle.
I want to make a
The good
side.
news is that's being mitigated somewhat, but you're spot on. It's.
I want to make a side comment about the kind of this whole kind of like, chasing after kind of Harvards of the world. So I have a friend, my high school friend. His dad went to a land grant college in Florida. And he did pretty well. And then at some point he would end up being a faculty member at Caltech and win the Nobel Prize in
Oh, wow.
chemistry. And the idea that and I think you say, hey, you anoint the 5,000 students going into Ivy League as that you're going to be it. That really closes the filter. And it's the whole idea is to have this giant net of land grant schools, and you just you run millions and millions and millions of students through the system. That increases your chance of hitting the next Nobel Prize laureate, because again, those 5,000 kids are super smart, and some of them will become Nobel laureates. But again, some of these, it's you're not going to be able to pick out who's going to be that Nobel Prize laureate at age 50 when they're 18.
Fair point. Actually, one of the things, a very unpopular opinion of mine that people kind of laugh at me, but I'm still going to stand behind it, is I think the current 4-year structure of university degrees for a bachelor's for mostly, or BSs, MBAs, I think is dumb. I don't understand why I need to take all these GE classes about stuff. If I'm going to be a computer science major, why am I taking all of these other class? And I cannot get my degree unless I'm taking geology. Huh?
You're hitting a nerve.
I'm going to disagree.
I totally agree that there needs to be different approaches for different kind of careers and paths.
But I'm going to disagree.
Things, and hopefully you do.
I know. Like I said, very unpopular opinion of mine.
Well, I mean, but just to make a quick point, because it is important. We have some people susceptible to conspiracy theories right now who end up with some just whacked out politics, right? Like, for instance, let's just blow up Social Security, right? And I do think, and again, you might be able to check the box in high school, to your point, and then not have to go there again in university. But to understand how the system works, civics, politics, history, right? This is how we got here. Here's what's going on. That is so essential for good citizens. And I think, I wouldn't be shocked if you found that some of this conspiracy theory thing that people have been homeschooled might be more susceptible to it. I don't know. Because that's a domain where you get some of the best and brightest. They've just had perfect homeschooling, awesome assets and people. And then there's some not so ideal kind of
well, I'm going to use
teachers and all in that. And so the variation's huge compared with the public school system.
So I'm going to use the Asian experience.
That's a key thing. Yeah.
I'm going to use Asian experience. Or use Taiwan, right? So for for years, if you didn't have democracy, if you're under military dictatorship, and all your number one or overriding goals churn out highly technically capable people, who and for the longest time, that was an important ingredient to move Taiwan up the chain. But then at some point, Taiwan became they lifted martial law, they introduced democracy. Now you need an informed citizenry, and you can't just teach again. This is the cost of democracy.
Let me preface my previous statement by saying not all GEs. I'm just saying if I'm going to be a computer civics, 100%. Speech, English, you should be able to know how to write and talk.
But then you start adding
computer science major, taking geology in a geology lab. I don't care. Even I'm never going to, unless I'm going into that particular study, I don't understand why it's a requirement of mine. Same with like, I'd argue some of the basic stuff I'm fine with, but the fact that I had to go all the way to discrete mathematics, and learning about matrices and all this other stuff. And I'm like, I get it. And, and to this day, I still have nightmares about trying to make a proof in math, because that's the one thing I could never wrap my head around. And, prove this, prove. I'm like, someone already else did. Unless I want to do that as a career, why are you forcing me to learn how to do it?
I actually had the option. We could trade off discrete mathematics for indiscrete literature, which was much more interesting. But
well, and literature is another one too. I mean, I think it's important that people get exposed to it, but
Okay, so I think this is and I think this is kind of interesting question because if you think about it, um, what what cultural commonality do you have as a country? So for example, right, if you have, countries, a lot of countries have national literature. If you're England, you have a set of common literature that you say, hey, these are our shared cultural heritage. And in your England, you know Shakespeare, you know Beowulf, you read about the 100 Years' War, and you read about and you have all this stuff, and I don't want to say we should have this mandated and we have to all read the same thing, but at some point there is that question: okay, what is our common literature in and maybe To Kill a Mockingbird is part of that common heritage. Maybe it's not. But I do think that having a set of um, literature that we say, hey, this is what makes this is part of the American cultural curriculum that we all have common with. I think that is something we should consider.
No, I don't disagree, but let's put it this way. Everyone here right now, well, actually, us three are probably exceptions to this rule or a bad representation. I'm just saying most people, if I talk about To Kill a Mockingbird or The Great Gatsby or whatever, I mean, I'm saying that they put so much emphasis on these things, but you ask them what the three branches of the US government are, and someone asked them a trick question the other day on TV, and I laugh, and at the same time, I'm like, that's kind of scary. They go, which branch is the most powerful? They go, the executive, of course. And I'm like, well, no, equal branch, no. So I mean, I'm thinking in my head, I'm like,
Oh
this guy
well, okay.
really thinks the
There's
president.
well, okay. Hold on. There's what legally and ideally it should be. But if maybe he or she answered it in the sense of what they perceive it to be, and again, that may be different
No, the
from
same person
how
didn't know
things get
that.
session.
Yeah, the same person didn't know that Mexico and New Mexico were not part of the same country. So it's scary out there. I'm just saying that, but to Ron's point, civics, for example, I don't think we put nearly enough emphasis on civics or even financial education as we do into literature and mathematics. But I think we're doing the wrong mathematics. Teach someone how to, understand APR and amortization, not how to, solve algebraic equations, with 37 freaking variables.
Well, I hear that a lot. I'm going to be somewhat disagree because I'm going to somewhat disagree in the sense that because if there is understanding APR as a general concept, but if you're asked to actually calculate APR, you kind of need algebra if you want to, for or
No one needs to
amortization,
calculate APR. But someone needs to understand what APR is.
right? But
I
but
don't need to
understanding,
yeah.
but understanding like and to actually understand it and to operationalize it. So again, I took calculus and I know how to do calculus, and I took a lot of statistics class. I got killed in my accounting class. My tax accounting, where you have to actually calculate amortization, I I I barely skated through. And again, so some of these stuff, some of these like kind of accounting concepts, yes, it's great. But if like you saw a lot of people, there's a reason why CPAs get paid a lot.
No, I agree. I'm just saying that I think to Ron's point about the general welfare of an entire country and being able to empower it to move forward, to become entrepreneurs, to become, we don't know what they're going to look like in 50 years, but we can definitely, at least I think we can all agree when I say their lack of understanding the US financial system from a practical standpoint is a detriment to their future.
Well, that I agree, but I would say, the whole idea of creating an entrepreneur is to create a supporting structure that makes it easier for them to be entrepreneur. You don't go into entrepreneurship because you want to understand, the tax law right down to its very last clause. You're better off creating so for example, in places like England, the taxes are already done for you. And so, yeah, right. And Americans like, what do you mean? It's again, that means that they're not spending hours and hours and hours of their precious brain time that they can use for something else on taxes.
Yeah, I don't disagree with the idea that you need a support structure to create an entrepreneur 100%. But before that, no one's going to be an entrepreneur if they don't understand how the freaking market or the system or the things in it work.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I think we need to teach more systems thinking and all. One of the points I want to make sure we get to, given we're under the umbrella of tax rates and federal deficits and all, sometime early 2023, after these midterm elections, we're going to hit our debt limit again.
Yes.
I think that's one of the bigger vulnerabilities we have next year. Now, obviously what Putin decides to do in Ukraine, if he, it would be just like a hallelujah moment if the man were to be thrown from power, got, sense enough to stop the assault on Europe. But anyway, so there are other variables, but I think this debt limit could be a massively disruptive thing. And here's the scenario. So a lot of people don't understand the debt limit. Basically, Congress votes on a budget and the president signs off on it, and that determines what your debt will be. So if you increase taxes and lowered your spending, you might have a surplus. If you didn't, you might, and almost inevitably will, have a deficit. That will add to the debt, and we will need to finance that debt. So this whole debt ceiling is something that separately we have to vote for, and it used to be perfunctory, and we're essentially agreeing we will pay for that debt.
Yeah, it's not allowing Congress to create new debt. It's allowing them to pay for the debt we've already created.
Precisely. And if we say, no, we're not going to pay for that. Oh my goodness, the ripple effect, right?
We already saw it once. We got downgraded once. I mean, what'll happen if it happens again?
We didn't even say we weren't going to pay it. To your point, we got downgraded because there was these wild flirtations with the possibility, right? So anyway, I say that just to say that, if we have a divided Congress, which is a real possibility, Republicans will get Senate and Democrats will get the House, we could have a situation where this stalemate could just be one of the worst kind of financial triggers. And so that'll be something that, talk about your, are you kidding me moments in economy and finance. This very topic you're focusing on here, Johnny, could become massive around that whole debt limit. So I'm hoping it doesn't happen, but we've got
the fact that we have to even explain it to ourselves, shows how much of an issue just understanding it is out there, right? And again, I think it's this is a very slippery slope to talk about, but it's hard to say these people shouldn't be voting for things they don't understand, but then that's anti-democratic. You don't want to go down that path, but at the same time, these politicians have learned how to use these conspiracy theorists and these naysayers to amplify their objective and just miscommunication and convincing these people that.
And yeah, and Yang has given me an idea here as he was talking about, things you need to know and like taxes and everything else, all these things. So one of the drawbacks of this age of specialization is there's so much we're dependent on that we do not understand. And it seems to me there's two kinds of intelligence. The first one is, are you good with taxes? Are you good at mechanical engineering? Are you good at programming, right? Are you intelligent? And, fortunately for us, there's a lot of people who are intelligent at specific tasks and we make them specialists and all that. And then there's kind of a meta intelligence, which is, are you aware of how stupid or at least incompetent you are on majority of things? Like for me, interpretive dance, fashion consulting, like, anything mechanical, right? Like that, I'm just stupid. I'm awful, and I'm getting to the old man stage now where it's not just that I'm not good at foreign languages. I mangle names that come from sounds of a foreign language, right? Like it's a classic old man guy. I just need my, slippers and my suspenders. But I say all that to say there's kind of a meta intelligence, which is, I know I'm dumb on this. And I think one of the reasons Elon Musk is scary is this guy is obviously brilliant when it comes to entrepreneurship and so many things related to that. But it's not clear to me that he understands things he's just stupid on.
He's not a
genius. Majority of
if one more person calls Elon Musk a genius, I'm gonna punch him in the face.
Oh, I call this kind of the YouTube confidence, right? It's kind of the hey, I know how to fly an airplane on a video game. So hey, I could just I just, you know, why
Yeah.
Why
are
is
we
it so
paying those?
hard? Why is everyone
Why
freaking
are
out?
we paying pilots $500,000? I can do this. You know, like no, but again, I mean, that's a very, if you listen to kind of this kind of sense of like incomprehension, that why, you know, why people are specialized, you know, these people who are specialized in doing these things, surely they must be awful at it. But I think this is kind of the larger, I feel like this is the I think the larger, I'm sorry, about kind of, you know, if you think about using this kind of surplus, it's, we're kind of lurching from we're kind of lurching from crisis to crisis. A lot of these are self-manufactured, and I think about is that um the 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 improvement of each step to the improvement of civilization, or the cost of improvement for the cost of each additional improvement in civilization gets more expensive and more expensive. It's
Mhm.
one thing to have people, it's one thing to improve United States in 1990 with just 1/5 of people who are literate. But in 2020, you need, you know, you need far higher proportion of people who are literate and who know what's going on, who understand the system, and who knows that, you know, because it's just much more complex. You know, the financial system, the bureaucracy, everything that goes into each additional step gets more and more expensive. And if you don't understand it, and you're used to seeing how the world works, and yeah, 1980 America is great, you know, and why do we didn't have to pay so much? Well, you know, 2020 America has so much more complexity to it, and this is where we have this ongoing system, and we just kind of take the path of least resistance. The healthcare system 30 years ago might kind of sort of work. It's kind of coming apart, and the path of least, let's just throw more money at it,
But you know,
and so on and so forth.
and you know, the ancient Greeks, right? They knew you had to teach rhetoric for democracy to work. And I think, to build on what Yang has just said, our world is so dependent on these complex systems, the financial system, ecosystem, you know, trading system, legal system, all these different systems. And we still teach rhetoric. We, you know, and to try to like, one of the problems we have today, I think, is we've got some elites who've gotten into models, created them, immersed in them, and they're acutely aware of certain vulnerabilities and what ifs that would collapse the system or make it thrive. And they're understanding that this variable and that variable. But if they talk, if you ever hear them just speak, oh my goodness, it becomes incomprehensible quickly, because they're trying to describe all these if thens, and it's just, rhetoric does not lend itself to those sorts of dynamics. And so it seems to me like one of the things that we want to transform education for, and it would apply for you know, spending at a government level and what that could mean for the larger economy else, is to teach dynamics to kids so that they learn to play with levers and play with this dial and that dial. What happens to the system when, you know, 1 degree, what does that matter for global warming? Well, let's play that lever. You know, let's just turn that dial. Now, what if it's 2? And what are the ripple effects? And so for us to understand systems, I don't think you can do it purely with language. It's way too complicated. But if we have things like civilization or these different video games, right, that kids can play with to learn, here's some consequences, and get kind of an intuition. You know, and this is one of those domains in which even the experts are scratching their head a lot, if they're honest, right? About, well, what will happen if we increase the deficit a little bit more? And then what happens if the interest rates go up coupled with that? And then what does that mean if all of a sudden that is a portion of our federal spending, we're now putting a quarter into just debt payment?
Yeah.
You know, what does that do, right?
Yeah. You know, and I mean, one of the main reasons that I wanted to talk about all these things was ultimately to kind of bring it back into the whole tax thing, was by reducing, you know, the progressive tax of the higher earners. Not only are we limiting the amount of revenue being put into the system for things like education and whatnot, but if you look over time, wages did not increase that much for the middle class. But what did increase was their tax brackets. So now they're taking home even less. Now, and you had CPI increase. So now they get hit twice. One, their money isn't worth as much as it was before. They're not making enough as it was before. And then just to add the cherry on top, we're going to go ahead and take a little bit more of what you were making so that we can keep the rest of the system functioning.
Go back, and this might be a great way to close out even. Go back to your graph about the income tax level and where it's peaks at 92% or so. No, over time. Yeah. So one of the little known facts out of history that just cracked me up, and I think it was sometime in the 30s, and FDR took over and raised the marginal tax rate. There was at least one year, and I want to say 3 or 4, where the only American who qualified for the top income tax, marginal tax, was Rockefeller. John D. Rockefeller. He was in his own class, right? So it was one of these things where, if you were way up there, you got that high marginal tax rate. And to your point, Johnny, if inflation changes over time and we don't adjust the brackets, then more and more of us are, quote, rich and paying these higher rates. But anyway, this is one of those levers that has consequences that are generational in terms of what investments we make now and what that means later. What you'll notice when Eisenhower came in, a Republican, put it on like 52 to 60. What is the marginal tax rate there between 52 and 60? So keep going up there. So marginal tax rate 92, brought it back down, cut it to 91. So a great little story. Eisenhower in World War I, he's part of a convoy that's trying to bring trucks and equipment from the East Coast to the West. And it took him 100 days because there was no interstate highway. There was dirt roads in places. It was just a patchwork of madness. He is of course, the head of the Allied forces of World War II. And he is riding in the Autobahn after they've conquered Germany. And he's just blown away at this amazing highway system. And when he becomes president, he signs the Interstate Highway Bill. And that did 2 things. One, it obviously increased investments and just, that was a bump into the economy right there. Second, what people hadn't thought as much, had any real intuition about, is now all of a sudden it's feasible for you to do interstate trade or just even across the state trade, where now you can just drive over there pretty easily, get there in 2 hours, and you can buy this thing that's cheaper or sell something in a new market. It actually increased GDP. Estimates are between 0.5% a year growth to 1%, which is massive when you think about, on average, we're about 2.25% per year. So these investments done right have this ripple effect that transforms the world. In fact, it ended up creating the Hilton hotel chain, which finally gave us Paris Hilton. So there are these consequences you cannot predict. But
Paris Hilton is a major consequence. You are right.
Well, I guess mitigated now by the passage of time and the ephemeral nature of fame. But anyway, yeah. So I think those are Thanks for the conversation, guys.
Thank you, guys. I really appreciate it. And as always, I appreciate your insight and your time, and we will talk next time about whatever it is I find next.
Thanks, Johnny. Thanks, Shane.
All right, guys. Sounds like a plan. All right.
Sure. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Well, guys, thank you so much for listening in this week to the Real Geek Podcast. We hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please hit that like button and subscribe so you can stay up to date on any new episodes. This is Johnny Garcia in the Real Geek Podcast studio saying it's just math and science. Once again, thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.